Alrighty, it's 10:30, so let's go ahead and start. I wanted to start off by letting you know that you have 2 chapters of reading assigned for this week. Chapter 4 was actually assigned for today, but I didn't ask any questions on Top Hat. And Chapter 5 is due for Friday, and there are 2 multiple choice questions on Top Hat that are assigned to you as homework. So please go ahead and read Chapter 4 if you haven't already, and Chapter 5, and answer those questions on Top Hat before class starts on Friday for your participation points. So today we're going to talk about deltas, and the lecture is titled Mississippi River Delta, and certainly we'll spend some time on the Mississippi River, but I'll be talking about a variety of other deltas around the world as well, as we typically do in these classes. So the learning goals for today are to understand rivers and deltas, how they're related, look at sediment erosion and deposition patterns in channelized systems like rivers and streams and deltas. We'll learn about the different types of deltas. We'll focus in a little bit on the Mississippi River Delta, and we'll look at the economic value of deltas. The learning goals for today are to understand that there are typical locations where sediment tends to be deposited in a riverine system. So there's kind of some rhyme or reason to how rivers operate. There are forces that create different forms of deltas, and these are rivers, tides, and waves, and the balance of each of these kind of determines what the delta will look like. So we'll see that. We'll see that the prehistoric and historic delta lobes of the Mississippi River Delta have influenced the formation of the Louisiana coastline, and that delta landscapes contribute heavily to some of the most influential economies and societies in the modern world. So let's start off at the basic level talking about the difference between rivers and deltas. So rivers and deltas are separate, but they're related features. So rivers are channels that contain water that's flowing downhill. And then where the river meets a larger body of water, typically a delta, a visible delta forms. And a delta is simply defined in this course as a wetland that forms as rivers empty their water and sediment into another body of water. And so that can be a lake, it can be a sea, a gulf, the ocean, and then rarely you might get an inland delta that can form over dry land as a river empties its water and sediment over a larger landscape like a desert. And we'll actually see an example of this type of thing in today's activity. It's not really the focus because it's not really a coastal feature, but it is a delta and it's pretty cool. So this is a picture of the Horton River Delta, which drains into the Arctic Ocean through Canada. So you can see the delta, you see the river here, and then the river enters the ocean. I think this is the Beaufort Sea. And as it does, it spreads out into these tiny little tendril streams, and you can see all of the sediment kind of splayed out into the sea there. So that would be an example of a delta. Deltas are depositional environments. So it's an area where a lot of sediment is deposited that makes these delta features that we can see. Fast-moving water in rivers can carry a lot of sediment. Here, for example, is an image of the Amazon River, which is a very large and fast-moving river. And you can see how muddy it is. They really do carry a lot of sediment material. As soon as the water slows, the sediment starts to drop out. So fast water can carry a lot, slow-moving water, not so much. And when water is completely stationary, then you can see over time all of the different sediments start to fall out. There are typical locations in a river or delta system where sediment tends to be deposited. And so these include at the delta itself, where the flowing water meets standing water and slows down. when water starts to move over a shallow flat, like a floodplain, and when river water moves over a shallow region of the river itself. And so the commonalities of all of these are all times when the river water slows down and that sediment can drop out of the flowing water. And these three cases we're going to talk about each in turn in the next 3 slides. All right, first case, a delta where the river meets the sea, or the lake, or any sort of large standing body of water. So when a river enters standing water, its velocity slows. That standing water serves as an actual barrier to movement. So you just get something moving really fast, kind of crashing into something that's not moving at all. As that water slows down, it kind of backs up. And so what you end up getting are a bunch of branches of the river forming and kind of spreading out to deal with that slowing down. And so we call these distributaries or branches of the river. And so in this image here, you can see the distributaries are these thin tendrils of the river that appear as the river is approaching the sea. The river water can flow dominantly through any one of these streams or multiple of these streams at a time. It doesn't have to be flowing equally through all of them. And typically what happens is kind of like a garden hose that's on high kind of whips back and forth. What you tend to get is the dominant flow of water will whip back and forth through these distributaries across the region. And as it does so, the slow-moving water drops its sediment into each of these locations. And so you end up seeing sediment being dropped into a very wide area. Typically, coarse-grained sediment drops out first as the water starts to slow. And so you get a lot of sand buildup kind of like up more towards the river itself. And then the fine-grained mud and clays get carried further into the delta before settling. And so you get a lot, near the edge of the delta, the seaward edge of the delta, you'll get a lot of those really fine sediments. So the muds and the clays always drop out last. They are the least heavy, and so they can be carried by even some slow-moving water. This next case, when we're talking about how sediment deposited in river systems, has to do with floodplains. So deltas, as a rule, are lowlands that lie barely above the sea level. They're where rivers meet essentially sea level. So they're at or slightly above sea level. And that means they're at high risk of being flooded by rising water coming down the river or rising water coming from the coast. So deltas and flooding really go hand in hand. When those delta streams or distributaries flood, the water will flow out of the main channel here and across the adjacent land, which is considered a floodplain. When that water moves into the shallow floodplain environment, it impacts the earth. It's moving out in a really thin layer, and so there's a lot of friction between the water and the earth beneath it. And so the velocity of the water movement drops drastically, pretty quickly, as it moves across the floodplain, and the sediments will all drop out. So most of it, including the coarsest sediment, will pile up right at the banks of the river, right as that water starts to slow down. And this forms natural levees, so natural riverbanks that are kind of built up. And so when the floodplains recede, it's going to leave behind these hills that will help to keep the river on course in the future until the next flood happens. And then this water is not really going to come back to the river, and so even the very fine sediment that's contained in those floodplain waters will drop out as the water flow stops completely, and eventually all of that water just evaporates. And so you can see here, this is an example of an area where a river burst its banks. because of a flood. And in the floodplain, it dumped a whole bunch of muddy sediment that you can see now that that water has dried up. So this is the reason that we can have vertical growth of deltas, so they can build up over time in these layers upon layers of floodplain sediments. This is some advanced material, so now I'm going to be talking about where sediment is deposited in the actual river system. So there are some areas where river flow slows down or speeds up, and you get deposition or erosion depending. So we'll talk about that. So as a river or delta channel's banks erode over time, they end up forming large bends and then eventually horseshoe-shaped loops called meanders. So a meandering river is a very typical form for a river to take because it's really natural for a river to slowly morph into a meandering kind of feature. That's because whenever you get some sort of bend in the river, so a bend like this meander here, the force of the water is much quicker and much more like jet stream-like around the outside of the bend. And so there it tends to cut a steep cliff or a cut bank and erode away any sort of sediment and leave behind a really steep feature. And then there's hardly any flow on the inside of the bend here, and so this is where the water slows down and you end up getting sediment deposition. So on the outside, the force of the water carves out a cut bank. On the inside of the bend, material is deposited, and we call these deposits point bars. So it's a sandbar on the point, essentially, of a meander. So in this picture here, you can see a very large, broad point bar forming on this meander. And if you look carefully at this picture, there's essentially a steep cliff face on the outside of the bend. All right, any questions about river and delta formation? We will talk more shortly about some additional features of delta formation. But before we do that, I have an activity for you all. So I think you'll find this one fun. It has to do with elephants. It's about the Okavango River Delta, which is an inland delta. So it's not a coastal feature, but it's a delta that feeds into a desert. And I want you to explore the importance of animal-environment interactions. So it's not just geology, it's not just river flow that carves out channels. Sometimes animals can have a big impact too. So go ahead and work through this assignment on Top Hat. I'm going to give you guys, I'll check back with you in 10 minutes, so around 10:55. Let me know if you have questions. Anton, are you talking about the article that shows up at the bottom? Yep, I'll link you all a different article. It was covered by a wide variety of news sources, so I'll go ahead and link another one for you. I'll do it in chat there. Okay, I don't think The Guardian is subscription based, so I'll give you that one. And then I know that BBC is not, but this article was very like bullet points like, so it's kind of boring to read, I thought, so I'll link that one just in case. So one of those should work. All right, I think most of you have put in a response. If you need a bit more time, you can just mute me and finish up your response. But I'll go over what I was looking for. So what triggers the massive movement of wildlife towards a flooded delta? Well, the delta stays flooded for a lot longer than much of the riverbank. And so after the floods start to trickle down, the wildlife will move and congregate in the delta to get that last little bit of water. And that's because this is an inland delta. So the delta is actually flowing into the desert. What do you think is meant by the term animal-environment interactions? That's what I was trying to get at with this in-class assignment, is to look at how environments can kind of, or how animals can kind of shape their environments. And so what I'm looking for is an answer that describes how animals can impact the way that the delta functions, or how the way their environment functions. Some examples from the video would be the elephants moving in a path would actually carve out the way for new channels. And the elephants eating those palm seeds and partially digesting them would allow for islands to build up, palm islands to build up. And then I didn't really ask you any specifics about this article, but I wanted to let you know that this is happening, that there was in the past year a massive die-off of these elephants in Botswana. Not enough to make a huge impact on the population, but enough to be certainly concerned about the future for these elephants, especially because it seems as though the cause was a relatively natural one, a harmful algal bloom. So my question was, how might the elephant die-off impact the Okavango River Delta in the future? Well, these elephants are engineers really of the Delta, so they're the ones kind of figuring out or determining ultimately which way the water is going to flow, and they are actively engaging in building up the river Delta. And so this could have some impacts on, for instance, the form of the Delta in the future, and it may lead to, I would think, maybe enhanced erosion if we don't have as many palms growing in the delta, or changes in the way that the delta flows if we don't have elephants kind of carving out those channels. Those would be my expectations, but this was, one of those no right answer kinds of questions, just something for you to think about. Back to lecture. Come on. There we go. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit more about how deltas get their shape. So there are 3 different forces that create different forms of deltas, and these are shown in this triangle here. We have waves, rivers, and tides. And depending on the dominance of the forces in whatever coastal region you're looking at, if you have something that's wave dominated or river dominated or tide dominated, you might get a different type of delta form. So for instance, if we're looking at deltas dominated by river flow, you have a really strong river, a really large river, not a whole lot of tidal activity. The area where the river is draining is relatively protected from the ocean's waves. So these would all be characteristic of the Gulf of Mexico for sure. Microtidal, protected from peninsulas and from the island of Cuba, protected from wave activity. If you have a river-dominated delta, then those deltas tend to be elongate. And so you might have something like a classic bird's foot delta form. You can see kind of, if you squint a little bit, how the Mississippi River Delta looks kind of like bird claws. And so that would be an example of a bird's foot delta. And in my next slide, we'll go into more detail about this type of delta because it's important for the Mississippi. Deltas dominated by tides are considered estuarine. So we've talked about estuaries and how estuaries have very characteristic flow patterns in terms of how the fresh and salt water mix. And so if we have a river that's dumping water into an area that's very tidal, you get a lot of mixing between the fresh water and the salt water, and you tend to have these typical estuarine circulation patterns form. Delta is dominated by wave activity, so rivers that empty into areas that have a lot of wave activity are known as cuspate. And so these types of deltas, like the San Francisco Delta, are kind of diamond shaped. You get kind of a triangular pattern, but the wave activity beats back a lot of the material that accumulates closest to the ocean or sea. And so you end up getting kind of a diamond pattern form. And so that's what's considered cuspate. And then the last major example that we have here is a lobate form. And so this is a type of delta that forms when you have pretty strong wave and river activity. So somewhere in between those two things are most the strongest forcing. And you end up getting this lobate form, which is roughly triangular in shape. So it's kind of a triangular fan shape cut through by a variety of small streams, small distributaries. So that would be a lobate form. And you can see how there's a bunch of different lobes here, right? That one's pretty easy to see. Let's talk a little bit more about a bird's foot delta, which is so important for the Gulf. The Mississippi River Delta is the classic example of a bird's foot delta. These deltas tend to have one or very few major distributaries near their mouths. So most of the water is flowing through essentially one channel. The receiving basin, in the case of the Mississippi River, it would be the Gulf of Mexico, has currents that often carry the sediment away as it exits the distributary mouth. And so you don't get a whole lot of sediment kind of building up in a fan shape. Instead, you get kind of one channel building out, and then the sediment kind of disappears from there. So there's going to be a broad, shallow shelf that deepens abruptly. So that delta grows long and thin like bird's toes. And so that's what we have in the Gulf of Mexico. We have a very broad shelf, and then it drops down into deep ocean territory. And because you need all of these different things to happen to form a bird's foot delta, they're not very common. So they're really not common along ocean coasts. Usually the action of the ocean currents and waves is too strong, and it overwhelms the action of the river. So Mississippi River Delta is quite special. Another example of a bird's foot delta is the Ural River Delta, which travels through Russia and Kazakhstan and empties into the Caspian Sea. And you can see an image of that delta here. It kind of looks more like a Christmas tree than a bird foot, but it's definitely elongate, right? This is a long river delta. Not very fan-shaped, not lobate. Does that mean that bird's foot deltas are more common in areas inland? So actually, inland, if we're talking about rivers that actually flow into land, like the one that you learned about in Okavango, those tend to be really more lobate. They spread out, the sediment spreads out in a fan. However, bird's foot deltas are more common for rivers that feed into sheltered environments like seas or gulfs that don't have a lot of openings to the ocean. So that's why this one is feeding into the Caspian Sea, which doesn't have very many openings to the ocean, not a lot of tidal activity, not a lot of wave activity. So I would say bird's foot deltas are more common in areas where rivers feed into inland seas. was a really interesting process through geological time that built up the Louisiana coastline. So the Mississippi River I apologize for all the words on this slide. We'll step through it. The Mississippi River actually used to change its course in search of a shorter route to the coastline, approximately every 1,000 to 1,500 years. And so this process is known as delta switching. You can see here, if you step through time, all of the different paths the Mississippi River took to get to the Gulf of Mexico. The first about 4,600 years ago through Atchafalaya Bay, and then it moved over here to this second point, all the way over here to form New Orleans in this third lobe, fourth lobe, fifth lobe, and finally here it is in its sixth lobe forming the Mississippi Birdfoot Delta. And so this Birdfoot Delta started forming about 550 years ago. So not that long ago in the grand scheme of things. So these prehistoric and historic delta lobes of the Mississippi River Delta have influenced the formation of the Louisiana coastline. A lot of the land that formed in some of the earlier lobes, like in Atchafalaya Bay, has disappeared over time as the river changed its course and stopped delivering sediment to those areas. But you have other areas where a lot of land has built up. Like, for instance, the whole Birdfoot Delta did not used to be land at all. It used to be part of the Gulf of Mexico. So as the river changed its course, you have the natural flow of freshwater and sediment resulting in periods of land building and land loss in different areas of the delta that ultimately formed what we know as the Louisiana coastline. Starting with the earliest European settlement, people really had a hard time with this feature of the Mississippi River. It's not really convenient to have a nearby river that randomly switches direction. You don't really want the river to suddenly be flowing over the place where you've built your house one day. So it makes sense that it was deemed necessary to kind of channelize the river and create man-made levees and other barriers to keep the river on course. And this was done in pretty much in the 1930s was when we started to really prevent the river from switching to a different lobe. If the Mississippi River was not channelized by humans starting in the 1930s, the Mississippi River likely would have switched back to the Atchafalaya Bay lobe some time ago. The river wants to go over here. We are preventing it from doing so. Even though we are preventing the river from switching over to that new lobe, we do allow some water to flow, where the river wants to go through the Atchafalaya River. So the Army Corps of Engineers lets about 30% of the river flow to the Atchafalaya River to form essentially a new delta where the Atchafalaya River lobe would be. This water and the sediment it carries is actively building deltas in Atchafalaya Bay and Wax Lake Outlet. So this would be Atchafalaya Bay, and this is Wax Lake Outlet, and you can see that there's a fan-shaped, approximately lobate delta building up in both locations. And if you want to see how those have changed over time, I have a great link here that you can follow later when you download the slides. It's pretty cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and ask you a question, just one question today. So the question is, multiple choice, how has delta switching influenced the formation of the Louisiana coastline? And this is only one correct answer question. I'm only going to have this open for about one more minute, so please go ahead and click submit if you have not done so already. Okay. So the answer that most of you got correct is B. As the river changed course, the natural flow of freshwater and sediment resulted in periods of land building and land loss in different areas of the delta. Um, Looks like a couple of you chose D, so every 1,000 to 1,500 years, the Mississippi River flow will alternatively turn on or off. So the Mississippi River flow doesn't turn on or off, it just continues flowing. It'll just flow out of different areas. Alrighty, last few slides. So let's talk about economics and the impact of deltas on the economic sphere of world powers. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Pearl River Delta region of China as an example of how delta landscapes contribute heavily to some of the most influential economies and societies in the modern world. So the Pearl River Delta in China is one of the most densely urbanized regions in the world, and it's often considered a megacity. And so the delta itself is right here. You can see the water flowing into China. This is located here on the southern part of China. The delta's right here, and around this delta you have many, many major cities, including Hong Kong. All of these are gigantic cities in their own right, but there's a lot of movement and trade in between all of these in the small region. So it's considered a megacity, a city of cities. Not too long ago, China chose to invest heavily in bolstering the economy of the Pearl River Delta, which used to be farmland. And most of the money that they have spent in improving their economy has gone into this area. They early on decided that this was what they wanted to spend their money on, and they wanted to make it into a highly industrialized area. So this is what the delta looks like now, whereas in the past it would have been mostly rice paddies. The Pearl River Delta has been called the factory of the world due to the presence of industrial parks populated with factories. And so when your items say that they're made in China, they're probably coming from this region. So this region has really made a switch from rural farmland to a massive megacity full of industrial parks. Why would a country decide to switch a relatively rural place to a factory? What makes the delta such an attractive place to grow a megacity? Well, the low-hanging fruit is that you can have ports in a delta. So deltas are an excellent location for ports, and ports are an essential piece of the global trade and transportation issue. They're the lifeline for factories. So they allow goods to be exchanged in the global economy, and they allow people to move around. So having ports nearby is definitely an important part to choosing a delta as a place to invest lots of money. But there's more to it than that. So building such a massive economy that relies on factory production requires an abundant supply of cheap labor. You need to have a lot of relatively unskilled people to fill those factory jobs. And so China recognized that an agricultural area would be the best place to do so. Deltas are really fertile and highly cultivated. They tend to have a lot of agriculture, a lot of migrant workers. And so migrant farm workers have filled this need for factory workers in the Pearl River Delta. You might wonder how this impacts those migrant farm workers, and there's been some studies to kind of look at that. So new factory jobs and placement in those jobs is considered an economic upgrade for the workers and a social upgrade too. They can increase their social standing, but there are a lot of consequences to moving from rural migrant farm work to a factory job. So for instance, there's actually increased unemployment, increased work intensity, and increased living costs that these folks have to deal with. And so it's kind of an interesting situation to transition a region of your country kind of in this way. But these are the kinds of decisions that were behind deciding to invest in this delta. And you can definitely see how deltas are really important places for society. All right, so we covered a lot of ground today, everything from geology and sediment deposition to, elephants and the building of a megacity. So it's definitely a potpourri of topics. Today you learned there are typical locations where sediment tends to be deposited in riverine systems. You learn that there are forces that create different forms of deltas, and it really depends on the relative importance of river activity, tides, and waves. You learned about delta switching and how the delta lobes of the Mississippi River have influenced the formation of the Louisiana coastline. And you learned through the Pearl River Delta region how delta landscapes can contribute heavily to some of the most influential economies and societies in the world. And in the next class, we're going to do a little bit more biology. We're going to talk about coastal environments. I'll also have a bit of time in the next class where we can discuss what's coming up in terms of your midterm exam. So we'll spend a bit of time on like housekeeping type activities. William, you want to, I can open up the quiz again for you. Just hang around for just a minute. You betcha.